Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Amy Berger, MS, CNS, NTP, has a master's degree in human nutrition and is a certified nutrition specialist and nutrition therapy practitioner. She's the author of the book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, and a proud U.S. Air Force veteran. Thank you for your service, Amy. Amy spent years doing what experts claimed were all the right things to lose weight and maintain optimal health, but failed to experience the expected results. Waiting to understand why the conventional advice about low-calorie, low-fat dieting and lots of exercise did not lead to the promised outcomes, she came to learn that much of what we currently believe about, quote, healthy diets is misguided and in many cases downright incorrect. Amy's blog, To It Nutrition, is a leading source of information on low-carb and ketogenic topics. I particularly have enjoyed and personally benefited from her gluconeogenesis article, fasting articles, protein articles, and her personal experiences and views on thyroid. I also love Amy's sharp wit and ability to weave stories into complex and scientific topics. Welcome to the show, Amy.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for that great intro.
Yeah, of course. Really appreciate you being here. And your backstory is really interesting to me. I followed you for a long time and read a lot of your content, read your book. But really one thing that I hadn't explored in poking around your page is sort of this concept of information overwhelm and getting started for folks on a low carb or ketogenic lifestyle. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you think about that concept?
Yeah, and thanks for asking about that. I don't think anyone's ever actually asked me about that before. When I was new to this many years ago, there were very few forums and blogs. I mean, the internet existed, but it wasn't like it is now. There wasn't a whole lot about low carb and keto online. There was a little bit, but it was limited. And you went to the bookstore, there was maybe 2 or 3 books. There were the Atkins books. There was Protein Power by the, Dr. Mike and Mary Dan Eads. But there wasn't a whole lot, not like it is today. And in some ways, I feel lucky. I feel fortunate that when I was new to this, there wasn't as much information because don't get me wrong, it's great that keto and low carb have become so popular that there is so much more information now. But unfortunately, because there's so much more information, there's also a lot of nonsense. And when you're brand new to this, you don't know what the nonsense is and what the truth is. And so, it's a good business model. It works out for me as a nutritionist because I would say 70% of what I do with clients is just myth busting and debunking some of the misinformation that they've accumulated up to this point. And I don't envy the new people. And so that information overload it's not even necessary. All that this diet requires is a low carbohydrate intake. There may be some little bits and pieces here that you have to change to customize it for yourself, but that is the most fundamental, basic, and frankly, most effective place to start is to not eat carbs. You don't have to worry about the kind of fat so much at first. You don't have to put butter in your coffee. You don't have to do all these crazy things that did not exist in 1972 when Dr. Atkins wrote his first book, and everybody did great on that diet.
Yeah, I love that message. And I love how you say things like you wouldn't have survived in today's environment with all the information and conflicting advice out there. And I love just making it really simple for folks because in my experience, when you and I or people with a lot more knowledge who have done a lot of the research get into these topics, it's easy for them to talk ad nauseum about the minutia. But when, a relative or a friend asks me, how do I get started on keto? How do I eat low carb? It's almost hard to articulate it really simply and just give them sort of simple, practical advice to make it really easy.
Yeah, and the thing is, this diet is easy. This is the easiest way of eating there could possibly be, except for maybe carnivore. Maybe we'll get into that. But, you don't have to weigh and measure your food. You don't have to track points. You don't have to count anything. All you have to do is not eat sugar or starch. And the rest, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but that's really what gets you the vast majority of the results of this way of eating. It's not supposed to be complicated. I think people who have made it complicated, I don't know if they have an agenda or they're trying to sell something. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't like to believe those things, but it's hard to believe how something so simple has been made to be so complex and overwhelming.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And one thing that is working against people in making it less simple is a lot of sort of societal norms. So you talk about this on Twitter. I find it so fascinating. It's normal to come in and have a piece of a donut that your coworker brought in first thing in the morning. It's normal to go and get, a heart healthy sandwich from the sandwich shop down the street for lunch, to have a bag of chips with it. But there's some societal norms, particularly for women, at least that I've noticed in the media, and I don't have firsthand experience, obviously. But can you talk a little about some of those and how that might be really hurting women with getting adequate nutrition?
Oh yeah, I'll get to the women specific stuff in a minute, but the first thing that you started with is worth addressing too, just where, there's the office party or somebody's retiring, and so there's donuts and cookies and everything in the break room, like, hey, let's all go eat. And nobody bats an eye when you take 2 donuts and a cookie, but when you bring your Tupperware from home and you're eating a big pile of steak and some broccoli, or maybe no broccoli, just a big container of steak, that raises eyebrows. Then people are all of a sudden, they're worried about what you're eating. So that whole thing culturally is very interesting. Nobody comments on your diet when you join them at the fast food joint 3 times a week for lunch. But when you stop doing that and you bring your eggs and bacon from home, then all of a sudden everybody's an expert on what you should eat. But the women thing is especially interesting. I don't know that I would say it's funny. It's interesting in that women, it just seems that we've been conditioned away from some of the foods that are actually the most nutrient dense foods we could possibly eat. And not only are they nutrient dense, we may need them even more than men need them. And I'm thinking specifically of red meat when I say that, because red meat is loaded with iron. All the iron that we lose when we, menstruate every month, we need that iron. We need the zinc. We need the B12. We need the selenium. We need all the other B vitamins that are in red meat and all the other minerals. Talk about a superfood, that like stupid acai berries and pomegranate juice and whatever, they don't hold a candle to something like a good quality steak in terms of the composition of the vitamins and minerals that's in that food. And for whatever reason, women have sort of been culturally conditioned to think that tearing into a nice juicy steak or a big fatty pork chop is unladylike or it's unfeminine. And part of that, I think, comes from the fat content. We've been so scared away from eating fatty meat for so long, but I also think it has to do with just the red meat aspect and maybe even the pork. Pork isn't really considered red meat, but you could almost kind of envision a woman eating a piece of chicken with the skin. So with the fat, like a chicken leg with the skin or a chicken wing with the skin. But talk about a steak with a little fat cap on it, or like I said, a fatty pork chop. And all of a sudden the world goes crazy. We joke on Twitter that there's this meme online that we call woman laughing with salad or woman smiling with salad, because it's everywhere. Like, you're laughing because you've seen it. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's this sort of stock photo image of a woman, usually a white woman, usually a beautiful white woman, eating a salad. She's got a lettuce leaf on a fork and there's some carrots and tomatoes in the bowl. And she just looks like she's having the time of her life. Because that salad with no protein in it and no dressing, boy, is that fun. Boy, is that satisfying to the soul. And you just never see it with men. The male eating memes are like a man in front of a big pile of steak or like chowing down on something else. And there are exceptions. This is not 100% rule, but just in general, we have been conditioned away from those foods. And it's really a shame because women, especially women of reproductive age, probably need that more than anybody, more than any other demographic. We need those foods.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you articulate it so well. It's a really strange phenomenon. And it's weird to think how that could have evolved. But I imagine, Amy, you're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of clients. You have a wealth of experience dealing with them. In your experience, what are some of the reasons that clients you work with are averse to meat or averse to protein in general?
Well, to be honest, a lot of the people who come to me are already doing a ketogenic diet and they're just not getting the results they want. So a lot of them have gotten over that. They are eating fatty meat. But I do get a fair amount of, again, usually women that are still avoiding red meat. And I don't think it's because they're afraid of it anymore, because they're willing to they're willing to do bacon and they're willing to put butter in their coffee and all this other stuff. And, I think it's just that they've avoided it for so long that it doesn't occur to them to add it back. Like if you say eat fat and protein, they'll eat chicken or they'll eat, salmon with the skin or maybe put some olive oil on it. So they're getting fat in some other way. They're still not eating the animal fat. I think it's just so ingrained in us that even when it's okay to eat it, they've done without it for so long, it doesn't occur to them to just add it back into the diet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's also somewhat perpetuated by a myth in the ketogenic community that you have to have certain ratios, you have to limit your protein so as to not spike your insulin and knock you out of ketosis. Can you talk about that a little bit? Obviously, you have a very extensive article that I would recommend everyone go read on your blog on everything you could want to know about gluconeogenesis. I've probably read that 5 times, but would love to just hear some of your thoughts around that, Amy.
Yeah. Thanks for reading that post. Maybe we can put it in the show notes if you have those.
Yeah, absolutely.
People do differ. So before I even say anything, I do want to say people's individual response to various foods, the responses do vary. Some people are more sensitive to the insulinogenic effects of protein than others, but for the most part, for most people, if your main goal in using a ketogenic or low carb diet is weight loss, or just metabolic health in general, you really don't have to worry about eating quote unquote too much protein. People are afraid of protein because they've heard that it spikes blood sugar or it spikes insulin and it turns into sugar. And there's a kernel of scientific truth at the heart of that, but it's so distorted and so misunderstood that the message has now become, don't eat too much protein. And I see people, who are really having a hard time getting the results they want because of this myth, because they're afraid to eat what I would consider a sufficient amount of protein. They're overdoing fat. So if they're hungry, instead of having an extra hard-boiled egg or another piece of chicken or another slice of pork or whatever, they'll have a fat bomb or they'll put 3 tablespoons of coconut oil in their coffee because they're afraid to consume actual food. And that works against them for weight loss. Now, protein does affect insulin a little bit. And I say affect rather than spike because there's a very important distinction there. A donut spikes insulin. A bag of Skittles spikes insulin. A big steak prompts a normal to be expected physiologically fine rise in insulin. And again, like I said, some people's bodies do differ, but for the most part, protein, even consumed in large amounts, is not going to have anywhere near the kind of impact and the degree of impact on insulin as straight up carbohydrate does. And with regard to how it, quote unquote, I keep saying that phrase, but I have to, otherwise people are going to misunderstand me, how too much protein, quote unquote, turns into sugar. It is true that amino acids, which make up proteins, can be converted into glucose. But just because they can be converted into glucose doesn't mean they always are, or doesn't mean they automatically are if you just chow down on a gigantic chicken breast. Because think of it this way, and this is the flip side of that nobody ever thinks of. Fats get broken down into ketones too, right? Fats can be metabolized into ketones, But nobody takes that to mean if I eat a lot of fat, I'll automatically be in ketosis. Like, let me eat 10 bagels, but as long as I eat enough butter and cream cheese on those bagels, I'll be in ketosis because all that fat is going to turn into ketones. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. It's not a mass action thing. It's not like if I eat a ton of fat and I still have a high carb intake, I'll be in ketosis. It's the same thing. It doesn't work when you say, well, if I just eat a lot of protein, it's gonna turn into sugar. Just because amino acids can be biochemically converted into glucose doesn't mean it happens just because of no reason.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation. And I liked what you said about folks erring too much on overeating fat and just trying to boost ketones. But just like you said, what really happens there is you're just spilling more ketones. You're creating more waste product when you overeat on fat. And that's not as beneficial as overeating on protein, because when you undereat on protein is such an essential building block. Can you talk about some of the benefits of why it's more important to overeat protein than undereat protein in terms of the trade-offs there?
Yeah. So protein is not just muscles. It's muscles, it's hair, your skin, your nails, your tendons, ligaments, connective tissue, all the enzymes in your body. Every single enzyme is a hormone, glucagon, insulin, like a lot of these hormones are made out of proteins, or made out of amino acids, I should say. So protein has a lot of jobs in your body besides just, muscle tissue. And when you consume protein, it's very satiating, meaning it keeps your appetite satisfied for a long time, assuming you eat enough of it. And this varies. Like some people will say, well, no, fat fills me up more. And for me personally, and a lot of my clients, protein combined with fat is what fills us up. Maybe like a chicken breast by itself will fill me up quickly, but it won't keep me satisfied for a long time. Whereas if I have like a fatty pork chop, I'm good for a while. But fat by itself does nothing for me. And it's weird because you'll constantly hear, oh, well, fat fills you up. If you're hungry, eat more fat. Literally, no joke. I could eat a stick of butter and still be hungry. Like just, slice it off in little pats. Every couple of minutes, take a little pat of butter. And before I know it, the stick of butter is gone, but I'm still hungry. I haven't satisfied my body's need for nourishment. All I've given it is all this empty fat. And I should clarify that the way that you formulate a ketogenic diet depends on what your goal is. If you have obesity, if you have type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, PCOS, if you're trying to lose weight, that's a different application than using a ketogenic diet as a medical therapy for something like epilepsy or Parkinson's disease or potentially Alzheimer's disease. It's a different, same approach, but different kind of goal, and you need to change it a little bit. So there may be some conditions and some people who actually do need to watch their protein intake. But when I say watch, I don't mean to go too low. I mean just you're not in the same category as someone who really can have almost unlimited protein and not have any problems. Some people do have to rein it in and keep it to a more moderate amount. But the protein, I just see too many people skimping on protein and overdoing the fat. And it's either causing them to not lose weight, or maybe they are losing weight, but they're not losing the weight we want to lose. They may be losing bone mass. They may be losing connective tissue mass. They may not be losing body fat, and over the long term, especially if you want to maintain a weight loss or a fat loss, it's really important to hang on to and build as much active muscle tissue as you can. That's not the stuff you want to break down to lose weight. You want to break down your fat.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love how you talk about the stick of butter. I'm right there with you, by the way. I could totally.
They call us butter snackers. We just
I'm definitely a butter snacker. That's going in my LinkedIn profile. But totally agree. And I think one thing that people can sometimes confuse when talking about fat to protein ratios a little bit, and I've heard this talked about in some places, but I think it needs to be emphasized more, is eating more protein and less fat won't always make you feel better, but it may result in the best body composition if that's your goal. So what I mean by that is, the ketogene style, using fat as a lever, having adequate protein, you're not going to feel amazing all the time. Fat loss is hard. It might feel better on keto or better on carnivore, but it's still not going to feel as optimal as when you're, overeating or eating at your maintenance, amount of calories. When people say, oh, my ketones were low, therefore I knew I was eating too much protein and needed to up my fat, or, oh, I was feeling tired and sluggish. My workouts weren't as good. Therefore I needed to up my fat and lower my protein. I question that because it depends what your goal is. If your goal is only performance or mental acuity or something like that, sure, maybe then you want to get your ketones up, but sometimes you just have to kind of embrace the suck a little bit and up that protein, if that's your goal.
Yeah, that's we use that phrase a lot in the military, embrace the suck. It's people don't like to hear this, but there are certain goals that might be not compatible. Like being ultra shredded, being extremely lean, being ripped, whatever word you want to use for it, might not be compatible with being in your best mental and emotional state. We see this all the time in the fitness, the fitness competitor community. Did I say that with the fitness competitor community? That's so hard to say. Those people look like dynamite. They don't have a lick of fat on them, but talk to them in private. They're emotional basket cases. They're wrecks. Extremely emotionally fragile because they're not getting enough fat, or they're getting whatever, something is unbalanced. That kind of thing is not really sustainable for the long term. Nobody lives at their contest level year round. So I do think, for the most part, you can reach a happy medium where you look good and you feel good. If you look extremely great, then the other side of things might be sacrificed. You might start to not feel as good mentally. You might not feel awful, but the holy grail is to look great and feel great. And some people find that, but some people, in order to maintain your best mental and emotional and cognitive health and function, you might be not quite as lean as you would like to be in your physical body.
Right. I'm definitely there with you. And Amy, I'd love to just transition. You mentioned it a couple times, and I know you're an expert on this. I'd love to transition to Alzheimer's. This is something that's very personal for me, runs in my family, quote unquote, and we can get to the genetic versus lifestyle components. But my father is terrified of developing Alzheimer's. I'm afraid of seeing him go through it someday. So it's definitely something that holds a special place in my mind. Can we just start with sort of at the basic level? How does Alzheimer's develop in the brain?
Yeah. So it's, obviously there's so much to cover, but to keep it really simple, to be honest, we don't know how and why Alzheimer's happens. I could speculate as to how and why, but the main problem, the thing that is not controversial, the thing that is known, is that the main problem in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's is that their brain has lost the ability to properly metabolize glucose. They can't get fuel from glucose. So it's basically like an energy shortage or a fuel crisis in the brain. And like I said, the $1 million question is why. We don't really know why that happens, but that is ultimately what the problem is. And when the brain doesn't have enough energy, you get forgetful and you get clumsy and you have changes in your personality and your behavior. The brain is a very, very energy hungry organ. Your brain uses between 20 and 25% of your whole body's energy supply. So when there's kind of an energy shortage to the brain, it's going to have major effects on your cognitive function.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. And how much do you believe, of developing Alzheimer's is based on genetic and sort of lifestyle components, given that we don't know what causes Alzheimer's for sure, but just based on, general population, why do you think Alzheimer's is a modern disease? We're developing it more. How do you think about genetic versus lifestyle, sort of factors in that? And why might they not be completely separate too?
Yeah. Oh, excellent. All of those are excellent points because they're not totally separate. One thing I should mention is that with this failure of the brain to properly metabolize glucose, that's why they actually now regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes, or they call it diabetes of the brain. So right away, there's some kind of relationship to glucose or insulin in the brain. And with it being kind of one of these modern lifestyle and diet diseases, you know, Alzheimer's disease is exploding in incidence, and the explosion parallels completely the explosion of type 2 diabetes and obesity and cardiovascular disease and infertility and PCOS and all of these other, hypertension, all of these other metabolic conditions that are largely driven by chronically high insulin. That might be new to some of the people listening, but a lot of those diseases and disorders have in common chronically high insulin levels. And Alzheimer's is no exception. Chronically high insulin is a major risk factor for this illness. And when it comes to all those other diseases, cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, nobody even questions that diet and lifestyle drive those conditions. Maybe there's some other factors at play, but nobody pretends like your diet doesn't affect cardiovascular disease or diet doesn't affect type 2 diabetes. Even in the conventional, regular medical world, like they don't even argue that point anymore. So why is it that when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, which is so similar to all of those other illnesses in that it was very rare a long time ago, right? Very, very rare to have Alzheimer's or type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease 100, 200 years ago. And yet now it's everywhere. So why do we dismiss even the possibility that Alzheimer's is every bit a diet and lifestyle disease, just like all those other ones are? And with it being, there being a genetic component to it, yes, there definitely is a genetic component. Something called the ApoE4 gene is currently the strongest known genetic risk factor. The people that have 2 copies of this gene have something like a 50 to 90% chance of getting this disease. So it's wow. A huge risk. It's an enormous risk factor. But I always point out that if you have a 50% chance of getting something, you have a 50% chance of not getting it. And so there's millions upon millions of people who have Alzheimer's disease that do not carry even 1 copy of this gene, let alone 2. And there's millions of people who have 2 copies of this ApoE4 gene that don't develop Alzheimer's. So there's some combination of that gene with something in the diet or environment or something we haven't even identified yet that's flipping that switch. What is triggering the susceptibility of that gene to make Alzheimer's disease when not everybody with that gene gets it? And it's believed, I mean, I don't want to go too deep in the weeds, but that variant of the ApoE gene, this ApoE4, as opposed to the 2 and 3, which are the other types in the human species, the E4 is believed to be the oldest one. And it was really forged way, way back in our hunter-gatherer times or even before then. And so it's believed that this gene is the worst match for the modern diet and lifestyle. If it's the worst match for a very high carb, very high refined carb intake, the worst match for a lot of the vegetable oils that we eat that didn't even exist 150 years ago. We didn't have the technology to even produce them. And by the vegetable oils, I mean things like soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil. And so it's not that this gene causes Alzheimer's, because again, plenty of people with this gene don't have it, and millions of people who have Alzheimer's don't have the gene. So there's something else at work. And, it's such a cliche, but there's that phrase, genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. But I think Alzheimer's and ApoE4 is a perfect illustration of that. If you have the E4 gene, but you live and eat in such a way to not trigger the susceptibility, then you're fine. But if you match that gene with a diet and lifestyle it's not meant to be matched with, you're going to get sick.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And you bring up so many interesting points and questions, Amy. I just want to unpack some of them. The first thing I wanted to note is that term type 3 diabetes, that's actually very well established in the medical literature, correct?
Oh, it's everywhere. I couldn't, when I started to research that, I couldn't believe how much of it was there. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And you raised some great questions about why is this disease coming up? Why are we not questioning diet? Why is it growing in prevalence more and more? And I guess you mentioned sort of this hypothesis around insulin and type 3 diabetes. Can you talk about how some of the conventional standard American diet foods, both carbohydrates and possibly seed oils, could be may increase the rates of Alzheimer's or set someone up for an environment that would cause Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so I do want to be clear that we're still not sure what exactly the cause is. Like I said earlier, we know that the problem is what they call reduced cerebral glucose metabolism, meaning the brain is not able to get fuel from glucose, but we don't know why. So and this is, educated speculation. Nobody's proven yet that certain foods cause Alzheimer's or make it worse, but I think there's reason to suspect, and I think the research should go in that direction. And so if chronically high insulin is a major risk factor for this, and it affects fuel metabolism in the brain, even though the brain's ability to take up glucose is not insulin dependent. Like a lot of people listening probably know of insulin as a blood sugar hormone, even though it does a lot more than that, but it's best known as a blood sugar hormone. And a lot of cells need insulin to get glucose into the cells. The brain, for the most part, does not need insulin to get glucose, but there's still a complex relationship of how insulin helps the brain use glucose once it's already in there. There's insulin receptors all throughout the brain. So anything that's affecting insulin levels or insulin sensitivity in different parts of the body or the brain is potentially going to affect cognitive function. And so the foods that spike insulin the most, for the most part, again, everybody's sensitivity varies, but for the most part, as a general rule, foods that are very high in refined carbs are going to have the biggest effect on insulin. So that's going to be anything that's sugar-based, things like candy and cookies, things that are refined flour-based, cookies, cakes, scones, pastries, stuff like that. Liquid sugar, obviously, things like sugar-sweetened sodas and, teas and coffees that have tons and tons of sugar in them. The seed oils are a little more interesting. Those are like we said, the liquid sort of vegetable oils. And the reason that those might be harmful is that if you've ever had a container of nuts sit around for too long and it turns rancid and it gets that like really nasty odor and you eat them and they taste kind of gross.
Yep.
When they go rancid, it's spoiled and they're bad. And that happens because the fats in those nuts have oxidized and basically they've just become damaged. They're rancid. You don't want to eat them. And at a cellular level, that seems to be almost like toxic. Without being like too geeky, our cell membranes, and including in the brain, including in the mitochondria, which is the part of the cell that actually makes energy. So if we've been saying all along that Alzheimer's is an energy crisis in the brain, then there's probably something wrong with the little tiny mitochondria that make energy. All of these little cell parts and pieces are made of fat. They're made of various types of fats. And if the fats that we're taking into the body are damaged, then we're going to end up with damaged structural fats, the fats that like make up the physical scaffolding of these pieces. And not only can those be damaged, but we eat these and we digest them and they can sort of set off like a chain reaction. It's called oxidative stress or oxidation, where if you think of these little damaged molecules as pinballs, like kind of crashing around the cell, crashing around these membranes, and each time they crash into something and bounce around, they're creating more damage. And a damaged cell, a damaged mitochondria doesn't function properly. And if the mitochondria is not functioning properly, you're probably not going to be able to generate energy. That's kind of a high level thing. And a lot of that is speculative. I mean, I think a lot of the research on the vegetable oils is, a lot of it has been done in mice and in rats. I don't know that there's a lot of human data. And it's kind of controversial because some people in the low carb world are very committed to food purity and food quality, and they would just never they would never buy ranch dressing off the shelf at the supermarket, never buy, blue cheese dressing with soybean oil or whatever. I myself do eat some of that stuff from time to time. I'm not a purist. I don't live on it. It's not my main source of fat, but I don't avoid it at all costs. And I think a lot of the studies that have been done with those fats have not been done in the context of a low carb diet. And I'm not saying that those fats are always safe to eat, but I think they are probably likely less damaging in the context of a low carb diet than in the context of a high carb diet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I hadn't heard that explanation or theory before of oxidized fat cells from the oils replacing fat cells in the brain. That's really fascinating. And why do you think, just curious, and understand we're speculating a bit at this point, why do you think omega-6 or PUFAs, vegetable oils, may be less damaging on low carb?
Yeah, again, total speculation on my part. I just think any environment that's hyperglycemic and hyperinsulinemic, meaning when the blood is swimming with insulin and glucose, it's already an inflammatory state. It's already a damaging state. So when you add something that's potentially harmful into that mix, I think it just makes it worse.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Really interesting. And
I mean, here's the thing, like so many people, myself included, when I was new to low carb, I didn't know anything about the food quality issue. The only thing I knew was that I had to keep carbs really low. And I was on a budget. I mean, I think I was in college at the time. So I went to the store and got whatever was cheap. And what's cheap is, ranch dressing and like regular stuff that's made with those oils. And I did great. I mean, I lost weight. I was in good metabolic health. All my blood work looked good. So I think one of the larger concerns with those oils is cancer risk. And again, totally speculating. I'm like wary of even saying anything. But I guess what I'm saying is whatever effects that stuff has in the short term, like, 3 or 4 years, somebody's been on low carb and keto and they're eating that and they're losing weight. They look great. Their lipid profile looks great. That doesn't mean that something bad might not happen over the long term. So I think the risk with those oils is really the long-term consumption, but I still think they're less harmful in a low-carb context than like literally adding more fuel to the fire, like adding them to the fire of hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's not just sort of the 1 + 1 = 2 effect, but some of these toxic foods or harmful foods can sort of stack on top of each other and produce an even worse effect in a way. I think that makes sense at a high level. And I'm curious, Amy, what in your mind, more speculation here, but why aren't neurologists and doctors, questioning diet in developing treatments and causes of Alzheimer's? You've talked about this on other podcasts, but why did you have to write this book?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. I've always said, like, I shouldn't have had to write this book. Some doctor should have beaten me to it. Some neurologist or some geriatric doctor should have written this book 5 years ago. I don't think anyone means harm. Like, I don't think there's some big conspiracy to keep this a secret or, that these doctors don't want their patients to have the information. I think they honestly don't know. I think that Alzheimer's disease, unless you look at it from the ground up, from the metabolic state up, it's a really mysterious, really scary, really complex seeming disease. And I'm not saying that it's not scary and complex, but when you look at it that way, from that perspective, it's almost impossible to believe that a diet could have an impact. Like, you're kidding, right? You're going to tell me that what I eat could actually impact Alzheimer's disease? Like, they would laugh you out of the room. But it's not funny at all when you look at the metabolic mechanisms that look like they're contributing to this disease process. It makes total sense. And I really think that people have nothing to lose in trying a dietary or lifestyle approach because, unfortunately, there's no alternative. There are no effective pharmaceutical drugs or treatments for this disease at all whatsoever, period. There are drugs available on the market, but they do nothing. They don't actually have any beneficial impact on the disease whatsoever. So it's, unfortunately, there's no effective treatment. What does somebody have to lose by shifting their mindset a little bit and approaching this from a different angle?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it is a giant, scary disease that people are afraid to experiment with and tinker with. And it just seems so mysterious, especially when it comes to the brain. We still understand so little about how the brain functions, at least from what I understand. How, Amy, can we either lower our chances of developing Alzheimer's? Or I've heard you speak about before, sort of there's two different versions. There's one trying to mitigate possible causes of Alzheimer's, and another which is someone who has Alzheimer's, how can they live with it and sort of overcome it or mitigate the effects?
Yeah, they're kind of the same thing, just to different degrees. So if I always say that the intervention that I think is needed to reverse a disease once you already have it, or to stop it from getting worse once you already have it, is a little bit different from the strategy that might prevent it from happening in the first place. And I once used the example of like a bug bomb. If you have an insect infestation in your house, you call the exterminator and he comes and he sets off this toxic bug bomb and all the bugs are dead. But that doesn't mean that you needed to have that toxic bug bomb set off in your house to prevent an infestation from happening in the first place. You know, you could keep your windows closed, don't leave food unsealed on the counter. Like, there's these lower level, more simple things that you could do to prevent things from getting bad. But once they're already bad, then, you know, drastic times call for drastic measures. So if the main problem in the Alzheimer's brain is that the neurons have lost the ability to properly get energy from glucose, we need to find an alternative energy source. It's like the brain is a hybrid car. It doesn't just run on glucose. It can run on other things too. One of the other things it runs on absolutely beautifully is ketones. And, you know, I'm sure some of your listeners probably know what ketones are, but they're just another fuel molecule that the brain really thrives on. And so regardless of what else may be going on in this disease, regardless of what's causing it, regardless of all this other noise out there, that's the bottom line. These brain cells are atrophying and starving and withering because they don't have enough food. Can we nourish them with some alternative fuel to glucose? Yes, we give them ketones. So this is why a ketogenic or low carb diet should be somewhat effective for either improving their cognition or potentially either slowing down the worsening of the disease or halting it altogether. I mean, it could potentially do any of that. But does that mean that somebody needs to be on a ketogenic diet for their whole life in order to prevent this from getting to such a bad state? I don't think they do. And again, this is assuming we can prevent Alzheimer's. Nobody knows for sure that we can. I believe that we can. I don't think there's reason to doubt that we should be able to prevent this if it is a metabolic and lifestyle illness. I think what you have to do to mitigate your risk is not necessarily live in ketosis all the time, but you have to keep your blood sugar and insulin levels within a healthy range. And the amount of carbohydrate that somebody can eat and still accomplish that is going to vary from person to person. Some people are going to have to be at ketogenic levels, 30 grams a day, 40 or 50 grams of carbs a day. Other people are going to be able to eat 100 or 200 grams a day and be fine. So I think you have to sort of keep your metabolic health in good shape. And it's just an individual thing as to what kind of diet is going to let somebody do that.
Yeah, that's excellent. I really like that explanation of both, different stages and intensities of the diet required for prevention versus once you actually have the disease and are suffering from Alzheimer's. And Amy, I probably should have asked this before, but what are the treatments, if any, that exist today for Alzheimer's outside of diet and lifestyle changes? What are doctors, neurologists prescribing? How do they try to overcome the disease?
Yeah, there are some drugs. There are some pharmaceutical drugs on the market. Most of them are what is called cholinesterase inhibitors. And that's like just a big fancy word that it inhibits the breakdown of one of the neurotransmitters involved in memory processing and learning. It's called acetylcholine. So they're acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. They inhibit the cholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks that down. And with the theory being that if you don't break that neurotransmitter down, you have more of it circulating in the brain to help stimulate memories and help, stimulate cognitive function. It's the same sort of thing with SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is like an antidepressant, with the theory being that if you don't break down serotonin, you have more serotonin in the brain to make you happy and to ward off the depression. And SSRIs work for some people, they fail miserably for others, just like these cholinesterase inhibitor drugs fail miserably for a lot of people with Alzheimer's. I do think at best, they can slow the progression. There does seem to be some evidence that they can delay the worsening. It doesn't stop it, it just slows it down. That's really all there is. You know, in the early stages, they'll tell you stay active, do crossword puzzles, learn a language, which there's nothing wrong with that advice, but is that going to do anything to delay the Alzheimer's from getting worse or to stop it from getting worse? No, I don't think it does. Alzheimer's disease is not a Sudoku deficiency. Sorry. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but like, that's what we're dealing with. Like, we're so helpless and we feel so clueless in the face of this disease that's what they tell us. Oh, do crossword puzzles, keep your mind active. Well, to say that Alzheimer's disease comes from letting your brain get lazy is it's a cop-out, frankly. It is a medical cop-out because you have CPAs, you have accountants, you have brilliant researchers, PhDs who get Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can't imagine doing the New York Times crossword is going to reverse or prevent your Alzheimer's. That's an interesting, and I like to use the word cop out, because it is something that requires a lot more investigation and effort. Amy, well, this has been super helpful. I'd like to shift the conversation. Have loved addressing some of these topics that you're a true expert in. Now would like to explore something that, you know, maybe you've learned a lot about, but would just love to hear your opinions on a carnivorous diet, zero carb diet. You know, you can be completely frank and honest. I would love to hear your honest opinions of the pros and cons, you know, what you like about it, what you see, what you're concerned about with it, and things like that.
Yeah. Boy, what a fascinating topic. It's really just mind blowing and interesting because it forces us within the low carb and keto community to ask questions that we were never asking before, right? Even within the low carb world where we already knew that a lot of what we have been told and a lot of the conventional knowledge about the human body and nutrition is completely wrong. Even starting from that standpoint, the carnivore people, the people that are doing really well on this diet, you know, force us to ask even more questions because on a what they would call a well-formulated ketogenic diet or a healthy low-carb ketogenic diet, you're still going to be eating green plants, you're going to be eating non-starchy vegetables, you're going to be eating, lots of greens that have magnesium and fiber and all that stuff. And it's turning out that maybe that's not necessary at all. I guess I'll start with my concerns first, and then I'll move on to why what fascinates me about it. My biggest concern is not like nutrient deficiencies or fiber deficiencies and all that. It's really more so the mental aspects of it in that, you know, unfortunately, anytime there's a diet with a name on it, a label, whether it's keto or paleo or vegan or carnivore or macrobiotic, anytime there's a diet with a trendy name, it tends to attract people with disordered eating. And we see this in the carnivore movement already. There's a lot of former vegans, and it's great. I think a carnivorous diet is way healthier than a vegan diet? Yes, no doubt there. But I also think there's a lot of people who are scared of food and who are scared of learning how to eat and are scared of diversifying their diet and doing certain things that they jump like a monkey swinging on a rope, if you can imagine, like swinging from one diet to the next, looking for the magic bullet, looking for the silver cure. And so I worry that people with that mindset cling to carnivore as just another way to have rules, another way to impose rules on themselves so they don't step out of bounds and do something bad, or I worry about it from that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do you think those people, like, what's the solution there? Do they just need to change their relationship with food? Do they need to ease up the reins a little bit? How do you work with those types of folks in your practice?
I don't get many of them, which is good because, to be honest, I don't have the real training that you need. I think you need specialized training to deal with people that have true full-blown eating disorders. I don't have the background, even like the psychological expertise to help them through that. All I can really do is like, here, eat this, don't eat that, and encourage them to not be so afraid of food. But to work on why they have those issues to begin with is much more difficult.
Right.
So
sorry, I interrupted you, but you were...
Oh, no, that's okay. It's your show. I don't know what the answer is for those people. Like I said, there's no doubt in my mind that a carnivore diet is going to be better for them than veganism, but I think it would be even better for them to learn to just eat and not be overly scared of what their body's doing or what they're putting in their body. Beyond that, my only real concern with the carnivore diet is just the potential, and I say potential because we don't know what happens, the potential nutrient deficiencies. There are some nutrients that are higher in plant foods, but of course, I mean, I'm very familiar with Ambro Hearn's work, and now we have Dr. Baker and all the old timer zero carbers, who've been doing a lot of research on this, that there does seem to be a lot of changes, I guess, or maybe adaptations, I could say, that all of the nutrient requirements, the amounts of nutrients and the RDA and the DRA for all those things were done in people on mixed diets, on people with diets with a very substantial amount of carbohydrate. And it may very well be that the nutrient requirements for the human body change dramatically when you're eating very low or no carbohydrate. If your body is not doing certain processes like metabolic cellular processes as often, you are not going to need as many of the vitamins and minerals that serve as essential cofactors in those biochemical reactions. I think you're always going to need some. It's not like you're going to need no magnesium and no potassium and stuff like that. But it also seems to be that our analysis of some foods was not accurate. Like there may be more vitamin C in meat than we thought, especially fresh meat, or there may be more of these magnesium, even things like that, in some animal foods more than we believed. So it could be that a carnivorous diet is totally adequate. I'm not sure. So I'm not willing to bank on that just yet, but I can't dismiss the hundreds, if not by now thousands of people that have been eating this way for years. So this isn't just some short-term 3-month, 6-month experiment. Some of these people have been doing it for years. They're not dying from scurvy. They're not dying from rickets and osteoporosis. They are, they're defecating just fine. It's not like they're not pooping without all this copious plant fiber. And they seem to be in excellent health. And now, of course, I have to remind myself, because I have a tendency to be taken in by what's new and shiny and like, because we have this guruhood online now. Like Sean Baker's very charismatic. He's very good looking. He sounds very intelligent. It's hard not to believe everything he says. But I could say the same thing about, so many other doctors and specialists online. And I'm not doubting him, but all I'm going to say is I have to remember that when I see things on Twitter and Facebook, I'm really only ever seeing the success stories. If there's somebody who's having a really hard time with it, they generally keep it to themselves. So we're seeing wonderful, wonderful results with people reversing rheumatoid arthritis and improving multiple sclerosis and like joint pain and acne and women, usually former vegans, but women becoming fertile again, menstruating again after not having their period for a long time. Like all these great things are happening, and I don't doubt that, but what are we not hearing? And maybe nothing. Maybe everybody's doing great, but we don't know. We don't know all the people that are not feeling their best.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I respect, Amy, and it's been constant throughout this whole interview and everything I've read and listened to from you is your healthy skepticism, and your humility in saying, I don't know, we don't know, and your ability to ask intelligent questions. I think it's really profound, and why so many people flock to your writing, and a lot of the content you produce.
I got to be honest with you. I say that stuff because I believe it, but also I don't want to get sued.
Good for you.
Let's put it out there. I don't want anyone to sue me.
Yeah, that's great. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think you make a great point that there is a selection bias in a lot of the information we see, and these anecdotes of people curing chronic conditions, losing weight, building muscle, turning around mental states, overcoming depression are extremely powerful anecdotes. And I think anecdotes have a ton of benefits. But there is a huge selection bias in anecdotes. I like to call it the CrossFit effect. You know, if you go on the injury forum, you're going to see a very different result than the people posting Instagram pictures of pounding out 2 workouts a day and building muscle and looking ripped.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of unknown about carnivore, but certainly I think it should be presented as an option, especially if somebody's already doing a ketogenic diet, and especially if they have a health problem or some type of issue that hasn't gotten better, or maybe it's only gotten a little bit better. My first piece of advice would be for them to consult with a knowledgeable nutritionist or doctor to maybe help troubleshoot, because maybe there's something that they can just change very simply about their keto or low carb diet to get it working. Or maybe they could try carnivore because maybe they are reacting to some last little bit of plant food that they don't realize they're sensitive to. I mean, I just think, I don't think everybody needs to do it, because obviously there's plenty of people thriving on a regular low carb diet, keto, even paleo, not even all that low carb, just eating a good whole foods, non-crap diet. But for people that have really truly tried everything, including a well-formulated, good ketogenic diet, and they're still not getting where they want to go, it couldn't hurt to try carnivore, because nothing is set in stone. They could do it for 3 or 6 months. If they don't feel any better and they miss their broccoli and they miss their cashews and their almonds, well, then go back to eating plant foods. But just like keto itself, whether it's for Alzheimer's or anything else, I think it should be presented as an option, not a requirement, but an option.
Yeah, that's great. I think thinking of it as an elimination diet is really powerful, and is sort of a step beyond keto, can be helpful for a lot of folks. And I'm just curious, Amy, don't mean to put you on the spot, but what is sort of holding you back from giving carnivore a try?
Oh, I just don't think I can do it. I want to. I actually do want to try, and I probably will at some point, although I will say straight up, I will be carnivore plus coffee. I will not be without coffee. So that will be my plant food vice. I'm not that far away. I mean, I have days where it's no vegetables, and it's not like it's 10 o'clock at night and I think, oh, I didn't eat any plants today. I don't miss them. I think it would probably be easier for me to do it if I didn't think about it and then I just did it. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I have nothing. There's no fear. It's not like I'm afraid of doing it. I like plant foods. I do.
That's perfectly fine. That's a reasonable answer. And you know, I think there are lots of people out there that enjoy the variety, enjoy, you know, being able to mix it up and have different textures and different flavors. So I totally respect that. I think ketogenic diets are incredibly healthy. I would never stop anyone from eating a well-formulated ketogenic diet.
Yeah. I don't think, I mean, obviously there's people thriving on all different kinds of ways. And hopefully the carnivore movement will not become reminiscent of the vegan movement, which it's unfortunate. Yes. I see it going in that direction where if you don't eat that way, you're wrong and you're not doing it the best way. And why don't you do what I do? And, the insults and the vitriol and the ugliness, it's going to make us all look bad if it goes in that direction.
Yeah. Keep it positive. I couldn't agree more. We have to stay away from the dogma. Well, Amy, this has been incredibly interesting for me. I think lots of folks will find this helpful. I really appreciate your time. Would love to just ask you where folks can find out more about you, where they can get your book and things like that.
Yeah, thanks. My website is tuitnutrition.com, TUIT nutrition.com. I'm on Twitter all the time. My handle is tuitnutrition, and my book is called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and you can get that on Amazon. And there is a Kindle version. There's no audio version yet. And I want to give a shout out. I think we have a mutual friend. Is that Doug Wright?
Yeah. Doug was.
Hey Doug, if you're listening, hello.
First on the show, and got to meet Doug in person a few months ago, and he's a great guy. Really, really generous and genuine individual.
Yeah, I met him at Keto Con in Austin this year.
That's great. Well, thanks again for your time, Amy. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to sending this out to folks.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.